The briefing tent at Nellis Air Force Base had no insulation from ego. Lieutenant Kira Davidson stood near the edge of the group, her flight suit crisp but conspicuously bare of squadron patches. The fabric was regulation clean, but it told a story of exclusion that everyone could read. Around her, veteran pilots traded war stories and inside jokes like currency, their voices echoing off the aluminum walls. Someone cranked the volume on the tactical display, only to be ignored as another pilot reenacted a barrel roll using 2 marker pens. Captain Jake Morrison spun the markers through the air, his audience of senior pilots laughing at the elaborate demonstration. Lieutenant Tom Bradley tapped his boots against the folding table legs, keeping rhythm with his own animated retelling of a close call over the Nevada desert. Kira waited. She always waited. Her laminated flight chart remained folded under her arm, precise calculations already memorized, but ready for reference. The numbers were her anchor in a room where gut instinct ruled and procedures were often treated as suggestions. Her name wasn't called until the final 2 minutes of the pre-flight walkthrough. Commander Richard Lyle, the mission lead, barely glanced up from his tablet as he rattled off assignments. Bravo 3 Davidson, first-time lead on the 15. Watch her spacing on ingress. The words came clipped, half-read, tucked into the last line of the mission order like an afterthought. A few heads turned briefly toward her, then turned back to more interesting conversations. No questions were asked about her readiness. No notes were taken about her assignment. She might as well have been invisible. Commander Lyle droned through the strike order in practice cadence. Time on target windows, push coordinates, abort lanes. Each detail met with nods and casual jokes from the squadron veterans. Captain Morrison cracked his knuckles and muttered something about easy money to the pilot beside him. Lieutenant Bradley pulled out his phone to check messages, barely listening to the briefing that could determine life or death. Kira followed every word. A red pencil moved in short, fluid bursts across her burn chart. She already knew the baseline numbers by heart thrust to weight ratios, expected headwinds, total fuel reserves. But she marked them anyway, not for reassurance, but for calibration. In a world where everyone else flew by feel, she flew by precision. When the floor opened to last-minute inputs, Kira cleared her throat. The sound seemed to surprise some of the pilots, as if they'd forgotten she was there. She spoke in a steady, even tone. There's a fuel calibration bug in the D-patch for the F-16's new flow meter. If the gauge runs hot, it may show an underburn. I'd recommend cross-checking manual flow at altitude. The room didn't exactly fall silent, but conversations quieted. 1 or 2 instructors glanced up, their expressions neutral but unmoved. Technical Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, stationed near the side table, laughed under his breath and muttered something about checking fuel by flashlight to his partner. Commander Lyle didn't even look up from his tablet. It's fine. We flew it yesterday. Just fly the profile. His tone wasn't cruel, just uninterested. Polished, final, dismissive. The kind of response that ended conversations before they could begin. Kira didn't push back. She nodded once and returned her focus to the chart in her lap. Around her, the room moved on as if she'd never spoken. Target simulations rolled across the screen. Jokes resumed. Someone cracked open an energy drink and tapped it against another pilot's helmet in a mock toast. No one said her name again. No one asked follow-up questions about the fuel system. Her years of meticulous preparation, her detailed knowledge of aircraft systems, her careful attention to technical bulletins, all of it dismissed with 4 words. Just fly the profile. When the group dispersed, Kira was one of the last to stand. Her chart stayed neatly folded, tucked inside her flight binder alongside checklists she'd reviewed dozens of times. She clicked her red pencil into its designated pocket, picked up her equipment, and walked past the cluster of instructors without being acknowledged. The assignment board near the exit told the story clearly. Call signs and telemetry tags for today's sortie were listed in neat columns. Kira's name appeared. Last, Bravo 3, Davidson. No squadron patch designation beside it. No nickname, no personal notes. Just a name and a number, as if she were equipment rather than a pilot. Outside, the Nevada sun created sharp lines between shadow and glare. Pilots in mirrored sunglasses strolled across the tarmac, nodding at each other, tossing flight gloves over shoulders, trading pre-flight banter at full volume. The air buzzed with heat and jet exhaust, the kind of atmosphere that made everything feel urgent and alive. Kira adjusted her grip on her binder and walked toward the ready line. She'd been here before, overlooked, underestimated, treated like a procedural afterthought. But today felt different. Today, she carried knowledge that could matter. The fuel gauge issue wasn't theoretical. She'd seen the data, read the technical reports, understood the implications. Whether anyone else believed her or not, she would fly prepared. She would fly smart. And if her instincts were right about the fuel system, she might be the only one who could handle what was coming. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of aviation fuel and heated metal. Somewhere in the distance, engines were already spinning up for the mission. Kira quickened her pace, her boots clicking against the concrete with the rhythm of someone who knew exactly where she was going. The pre-flight area buzzed with controlled chaos. Ground crews moved between aircraft with the efficiency of a pit. Crew, checking systems, loading ordnance, and running final diagnostics. Pilots clustered around their assigned jets, some chatting casually while others reviewed last-minute details on their tablets. Kira approached the manifestation where a young airman, Staff Sergeant Jason Wells, sat behind a wheeled console. His eyebrows lifted slightly when he saw her approaching, a reaction she'd grown accustomed to. New faces always seemed surprised. To see her in flight gear, "You with the Bravo birds?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "Yes," Kira replied, keeping her tone professional. "Bravo 3. Wells hesitated, glancing at his tablet screen, then back at her. "Even slot 3? The question hung in the air like a challenge. "That's correct." She kept her expression neutral, though something in his tone suggested confusion about her assignment. He looked at the manifest again, then stepped aside without comment. She signed her initials on the flight log and moved on, but not before catching his whispered conversation. With another technician, "They got her flying league today. Weird choice." The EV-16 assigned to her sat in Bay 7, its paint clean but dulled along the engine, cowling from repeated heat exposure. The wings showed signs of recent maintenance. She could see the variance in paint sheen where panels had been replaced or repaired. This wasn't the newest bird in the fleet, but it was hers for the mission. Kira began her walk-around inspection, a ritual she performed hundreds of times but never rushed. She checked the rudder trim, examined the alignment pins, tested the external cabling connections. Her gloved hand touched the landing gear housing lightly, almost ceremonially. It was a habit she'd developed during training machines, spoke before they failed, if you knew how to listen. Behind her, laughter rose from the next preparation area. Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Bradley were recounting something about a G-force simulator malfunction and an instructor who'd passed out mid-roll. Their voices carried easily across the tarmac, full of confidence and camaraderie. "Remember when Jenkins hit 7 Gs and started seeing tunnels?" Morrison's voice boomed. "The guy turned green as a dollar bill," Bradley replied, slapping his knee. "Still finished the sim, though. That's what separates the men from the boys." Kira kept walking her aircraft, checking every system with methodical precision. She'd heard variations of these stories, countless times tales of pilots pushing limits, surviving close calls, earning their stripes through sheer audacity. What she rarely heard were stories about pilots who prevented problems through careful preparation, who avoided disasters through technical knowledge rather than raw courage. Her cockpit preparation was meticulous. She ran the same checks she'd practiced since flight school, but always at her own rhythm. Nothing rushed, nothing skipped. Inside the panel pocket, she clipped her laminated fuel chart, a hand-built reference card covered with burn rate tables and handwritten notations that adjusted for air density, altitude, and airspeed fluctuations. The chart wasn't store-bought or computer-generated. She'd created it herself, cross-referencing manufacturer specifications with real-world flight data, environmental factors, and performance variables that most pilots either ignored or trusted to automated systems. The numbers were precise, tested, and proven. She'd memorized most of the calculations, but the chart served as confirmation proof in mathematics that she belonged in this cockpit. As she settled into the pilot's seat, Kira could hear conversations from nearby aircraft. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez was discussing weekend plans with his crew chief. Captain Morrison was running through his pre-flight checks with theatrical flair, making jokes about each system as he tested it. Fuel flow looking good, Morrison announced to no one in particular. Not that I need to worry about it. These birds practically fly themselves. Kira said nothing, but her fingers traced the edge of her homemade fuel chart. The technical bulletin she'd mentioned in the briefing hadn't been theoretical speculation. She'd spent hours researching the depatch update, cross-referencing maintenance logs, and identifying patterns in fuel system anomalies. The data was clear. Certain conditions could cause the flow meter to provide false readings, potentially, leaving pilots with less fuel than their instruments indicated. She tried to share this information to prevent potential problems for the entire flight. The response had been predictable dismissal, mockery, and the kind of institutional arrogance that treated preparation as weakness and confidence as competence. Her gloves were already secured, her helmet positioned beside the control stick. The visor was down, its surface reflecting the afternoon sun in fractured patterns. She took a slow breath and began her final systems check, each switch activated in precise sequence. The radio crackled to life as other pilots began checking in with ground control. Their voices carried easy confidence, the casual banter of professionals who'd done this hundreds of times before. No one seemed concerned about fuel systems, weather variables, or technical bulletins. They flew by instinct, by experience, by the collective wisdom of pilots who'd survived long enough to earn their wings. Kira flew by numbers. It had always been her way, even when it marked her as different, even when it made her seem overly cautious or insufficiently bold. She trusted. Mathematics over intuition, preparation over improvisation, careful calculation over confident assumption. Today, that difference might matter. Today, her methodical approach might be the only thing standing between a successful mission and a dangerous mistake. She closed the canopy, sealing herself into the familiar solitude of the cockpit, and began the final countdown to takeoff. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The mission window was opening, and soon the entire flight would be airborne, trusting their instruments, their training, and their luck to bring them home safely. Kira trusted her numbers. In a few minutes, she'd learned whether that trust was justified. The fuel gauge began its deception almost immediately after takeoff. As Kira's F-16 climbed through the clear Nevada sky, she watched the digital readout with growing concern. The numbers were dropping faster than they should, creating a discrepancy that would have been invisible to most pilots, but stood out like a beacon to someone who'd memorized every fuel consumption curve in the manual. At 5,000 feet, the gauge read 1,900 pounds. According to her calculations, factoring in climb rate, air density, And current throttle settings, she should have been looking at closer to 2,800 pounds. The difference was significant potentially. Mission critical. She toggled the fuel flow indicator, watching it bounce erratically before settling on a reading that made no sense. The mathematics in her head ran the calculations automatically. At this apparent consumption rate, she'd be running on fumes before reaching the target corridor. But her engines were running smoothly, her climb rate was optimal, and every other system indicated normal operation. The radio crackled with standard check-ins from the other pilots. Bravo 1, cleared for pushpoint Alpha. Bravo 2, systems nominal, holding formation. Bravo 4, all green, ready for ingress. When her turn came, Kira keyed the microphone. Bravo 3, lined and locked. Fuel reading unstable, running manual calculations. The response came quickly from ground control. Commander Lyle's voice. Crisp and bureaucratic. Copy unstable read. Divert Bravo 3. Drop from formation. Proceed to backup runway 5 for inspection. Resynchronize telemetry on ground. The order was standard procedure textbook protocol for any system anomaly. Return to base, run diagnostics, wait for maintenance to clear the issue. It was the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that would keep her alive and employed. Kira didn't respond immediately. She glanced at her hand-built fuel chart, then at the terrain below. The formation was spreading across the western edge of the training range, already showing signs of imprecision. Bravo 1 had overshot the approach arc by several hundred yards. Bravo 2 was lagging behind the planned timing. Bravo 4 was adjusting heading too early, disrupting the careful choreography of the strike pattern. She ran the numbers in her head one more time. Visual fuel assessment based on engine performance. Optimal. Calculated burn rate based on actual. Flight conditions, well within normal parameters. Instrument reading, completely unreliable. Command, this is Bravo 3. She finally responded. Copy the alert. Fuel system reading erroneous, but not critical. Proceeding visual navigation. To push point. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Then, command denies that call. Confirm immediate divert to backup runway. Kira didn't toggle the radio again. Instead, she switched to internal communications, effectively cutting herself off from ground control. Her fingers found the fuel chart clipped beside her leg, tracing the penciled calculations she'd made that morning. She'd prepared for this scenario, though she'd hoped it wouldn't be necessary. The landscape below unfolded in the familiar patterns she'd memorized during countless hours of mission preparation. 2 ridges, a shallow valley, a jagged outcrop shaped like a broken arrowhead. She didn't need navigation instruments to know. She was perfectly aligned with the planned route. The terrain itself was her map, and she'd studied it until every feature was burned into her memory. Radio chatter from the other pilots grew more urgent as they approached the target area. Seeing. Climb drift on approach vector. Confirming nose angle adjustment. Target window opening. Checking synchronization. The formation was falling apart. Overcorrections, missed timing marks, poor communication. Kira flew alone beneath them, maintaining perfect spacing through visual navigation and mathematical precision. Her fuel gauge continued its fictional countdown, now showing critical levels that should have had her declaring an emergency. She ignored the lying instrument and trusted her knowledge. The engine sound was steady, the aircraft's performance unchanged. She was flying on actual fuel reserves, while her instruments told fairy tales about empty tanks. The target corridor appeared ahead, a narrow valley between 2 ridgelines that required precise timing and approach angles. The other pilots were struggling with their automated systems, their instruments providing contradictory information that left them second-guessing every decision. Kira's approach was different. She'd calculated the optimal entry point, memorized the required descent angle, and practiced the timing until it became muscle memory. She didn't need instruments to tell her where to be. She could feel the aircraft's position relative to the terrain, sense the proper moment to begin her attack run. As she rolled into the final approach, her radio remained silent. Ground control had stopped calling her. The other pilots were too busy with their own problems to notice her position. She flew the corridor alone, guided by preparation and instinct, trusting numbers over instruments. The fuel gauge showed empty. Her calculations showed adequate reserves. In a few minutes, she would learn which one was telling the truth. The desert floor rushed up to meet her as she dove toward the target, every movement precise and deliberate. This was what she'd trained for, what she prepared for through months of careful study and meticulous planning. Not the approval of her colleagues, not the recognition of her superiors, but the simple satisfaction of executing a perfect mission when everyone else expected her to fail. The target appeared in her sights, exactly where her calculations had predicted it would. B. She armed her systems, adjusted for wind speed and distance, and prepared to prove that sometimes the quiet ones knew exactly what they were doing. The target corridor opened before Kira like a doorway between worlds. On one side lay the chaos. A formation flying gone wrong pilots, struggling with malfunctioning instruments, overcorrecting their approaches, and filling the radio frequencies with confused chatter. On the other side was the pure silence of solo flight, where mathematics merged with instinct and preparation met opportunity. She rolled into the attack run with movements that felt more like meditation than combat. Every control input was deliberate, minimal, precise. The F-16 responded to her touch like a well-tuned instrument, its systems harmonizing with her intentions rather than fighting against them. The fuel gauge had given up all pretense of accuracy. It now showed a steady red warning, claiming her tanks were nearly empty. But the engine's voice told a different story, steady, strong, consuming fuel at exactly the rate her calculations predicted. She'd been flying on mathematical truth while her instruments spun elaborate lies. Below her, the terrain unfolded in perfect accordance with her memorized flight plan. The ridge formations, the valley shadows, the distinctive rock outcroppings, all exactly where they should be, when they should be there. She didn't need GPS coordinates or navigation displays. The landscape itself was her guidance system, and she'd studied it until every feature was burned into her memory. Her descent angle was flawless. The timing was precise. The approach vector cut through the air like a blade, following the exact path she'd calculated during those long hours of preparation that her colleagues had dismissed as excessive caution. The radio crackled with increasing urgency from the other pilots. Bravo 1, aborting approach. Repeat, aborting approach. Instruments showing conflicting data. Bravo 2, requesting guidance. Navigation system appears compromised. Bravo 4, unable to maintain formation integrity. One by one, the other pilots were encountering the same instrument failures she'd warned about in the briefing. The difference was that they trusted their gauges, while she trusted her knowledge. They were discovering system problems at the worst possible moment, while she'd prepared for them hours ago. Her attack run continued in perfect silence. No radio calls, no system warnings, no distractions from the pure mechanics of flight. She'd effectively become a ghost in the mission, untracked by ground control, unsupported by formation partners, flying on her own authority through airspace that was supposed to be empty. The target appeared exactly where her calculations had placed it. Range, bearing, approach angle, all perfect. She armed her simulated weapon system and prepared for the final phase of the attack. This was the moment that would validate months of preparation, years of careful study, and a career's worth of being underestimated. The release was clean. The simulated ordnance tracked exactly along the planned trajectory, striking the target at the precise center of the designated impact zone. No drift, no deviation, no correction needed. The mathematics had been perfect, and the execution had matched the theory. As she pulled up from the attack run, Kira allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The mission was complete. The target was destroyed. The fuel gauge still showed empty, but her engines were running smoothly. Her flight controls responded normally, and her actual fuel reserves were exactly where her calculations said they should be. She'd flown the entire mission manually, navigating by sight, calculating fuel consumption by mathematics, and timing her approach through pure preparation. While her colleagues struggled with malfunctioning instruments and unreliable systems, she'd completed a perfect strike using nothing but knowledge, skill, and the kind of methodical planning that most pilots considered unnecessary. The return flight was as smooth as the attack run. She climbed back to altitude, set course for home base, and enjoyed the rare silence of a mission completed without drama, without emergency calls, without the need for rescue or support. Her fuel consumption remained exactly on schedule. Her engines performed flawlessly, and her navigation was precise enough to thread the needle between training areas without a single course correction. As the base appeared on the horizon, Kira keyed her radio for the first time since ignoring ground control's order to abort. Nellis Tower Bravo 3 returning from mission, requesting approach clearance. The response came quickly, tinged with surprise. Bravo 3, you're not showing on our tracking systems. Confirm your position and status. Bravo 3, 10 miles southeast, altitude 8,000 feet, all systems nominal. Mission complete. There was a pause then. Bravo 3, we show you as diverted to backup runway over an hour ago. Please explain your current status. Kira smiled inside her helmet. Bravo 3 completed assigned mission profile. Fuel system readings were erroneous. As predicted, actual fuel consumption normal. Requesting standard approach. The silence that followed was longer this time. She could imagine the conversation happening in the control tower, the confusion over how she'd completed a mission she wasn't supposed to be flying, using instruments that were supposed to be malfunctioning. Bravo 3, cleared for approach. Runway 27, report to debrief immediately upon landing. Copy clearance. Bravo 3 inbound. As she lined up for landing, Kira could see the other aircraft from her formation already on the ground. Ground crews were swarming around them, checking systems, running diagnostics, trying to understand why multiple aircraft had experienced instrument failures simultaneously. She touched down smoothly, her fuel reserves exactly where her calculations had predicted they would be. The line gauge finally showed a realistic reading as she taxied toward the parking area, as if the system had suddenly decided to tell the truth now that the mission was over. The debrief was going to be interesting. She'd completed a mission. She'd been ordered to abort, using navigation and fuel management techniques that weren't supposed to work, achieving results that weren't supposed to be possible. She'd proven that sometimes the quiet ones, the careful ones, the ones who trusted preparation over instinct, could accomplish things that surprised everyone. Most importantly, she'd proven it to herself. The debrief tent felt different when Kira entered. The usual atmosphere of casual confidence had been replaced by something more serious, more focused. Pilots sat in their chairs with unusual attentiveness, tablets open, notebooks in hand. The easy laughter and casual banter that normally filled the space had been replaced by the kind of professional concentration that emerged when things didn't go according to plan. Captain Morrison sat near the front, his earlier swagger replaced by a furrowed brow and the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for emergency situations. Lieutenant Bradley was comparing notes with another pilot, their voices low and serious. Even the ground crew technician seemed more alert, less casual than usual. Commander Lyle stood at the front of the room, his tablet displaying a series of telemetry readings that painted a picture of systematic instrument failure across multiple aircraft. The data was undeniable. Fuel gauges, navigation systems, and communication equipment had all experienced anomalies during the mission. "We have a problem," Lyle began, his voice carrying the weight of command responsibility. "Multiple aircraft experienced instrument malfunctions during today's sortie. Fuel readings were erroneous, navigation systems provided conflicting data, and communication equipment failed at critical moments." The room listened in silence. These were experienced pilots, men and women who'd faced equipment failures before, but the scope of today's problems was unusual. It suggested a systematic issue rather than isolated incidents. Bravo 1 aborted the mission due to unreliable fuel data, Lyle continued. Bravo 2 experienced navigation system failures that prevented proper formation flying. Bravo 4 lost communication capability during the approach phase. He paused, consulting his tablet. All aircraft returned safely, but none completed the assigned mission profile. Kira sat in the back row, her flight binder closed, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She'd expected this conversation, had prepared for it during her return flight. The systematic nature of the failures wasn't surprising. It was exactly what she'd tried to warn them about in the morning briefing. However, Lyle continued, we have an anomaly in the mission data. He clicked to the next screen, showing a flight path trace that cut through the target corridor with surgical precision. This trajectory shows a successful strike on the primary target, executed with perfect timing and flawless navigation. The room stirred. Pilots leaned forward, studying the display. The flight path was textbook perfect. Every waypoint hit precisely. Every course correction minimal. Every timing mark met exactly. It was the kind of performance that instructors used as examples of ideal execution. The problem, Lyle said, is that this flight path doesn't match any of our assigned aircraft. The telemetry shows manual navigation, no automated systems, and fuel consumption data that contradicts all other instrument readings from today's mission. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez spoke up from the side of the room. Sir, could this be a simulation overlay? Maybe ghost data from a training exercise? Lyle shook his head. We verified the data multiple times. This is real flight telemetry, recorded during today's mission window. Someone flew this profile manually, completed the strike, and returned to base using purely visual navigation. The silence that followed was profound. Manual navigation was a lost art, something taught in flight school but rarely practiced in an era of GPS and automated systems. The idea that someone had flown an entire combat mission using only visual references and mathematical calculations seemed almost impossible. Furthermore, Lyle continued, the fuel consumption data from this flight shows normal usage patterns, suggesting that the pilot correctly identified and compensated for the instrument failures that affected the rest of the squadron. Captain Morrison finally spoke up. Sir, are you saying someone flew the mission after being ordered to abort due to system failures? Lyle nodded gravely. That's exactly what I'm saying. And they not only completed the mission successfully, but they did so using techniques that none of us considered viable in modern combat aviation. The implications were staggering. Someone had possessed the knowledge, skill, and confidence to ignore malfunctioning instruments and fly a perfect mission using methods that predated modern avionics. More than that, they'd been right to do so, proving that human skill and preparation could overcome technological failure. The question, Lyle said, is who flew this mission? And how did they know to ignore the instrument readings that caused the rest of us to abort or fail? Kira felt every eye in the room beginning to turn toward her. Not because they'd connected the dots yet, but because something in her calm demeanor A quiet confidence suggested knowledge they didn't possess. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the tent, "I believe I can answer that question." The room held its breath. In the space of a few words, everything had changed. The quiet pilot who'd been dismissed in the morning briefing, who'd been ignored when she'd tried to warn them about instrument failures, who'd been ordered to abort. Her mission had just revealed herself as the ghost in their data. "The flight path belongs to Bravo 3, she continued. "And the reason the fuel consumption data is accurate is because I ignored the faulty instruments and flew the mission, using manual calculations." The silence that followed was total. No one moved, no one spoke, no one seemed to breathe. The pilot they'd overlooked, the one they'd considered overly cautious and insufficiently bold, had just revealed herself as the only one capable of completing the mission when their technology failed them. Commander Lyle set down his tablet and looked directly at her. "Lieutenant Davidson," he said slowly, "I think you better explain exactly how you accomplished what our instruments said was impossible." Kira reached into her flight binder and pulled out her laminated fuel chart, covered with handwritten calculations and worn smooth from years of use. She walked to the front of the room and placed it on the table where everyone could see it. "I used mathematics," she said simply. "The same calculations I tried to share with you this morning." The laminated chart lay on the table like evidence in a trial. Every pilot in the room leaned forward to examine it, their expressions shifting from skepticism to amazement as they absorbed the meticulous handwriting, the complex calculations, and the precise notations that covered every inch of the surface. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez picked up the chart first, his experienced eyes scanning the fuel consumption curves and burn rate calculations. "This is all hand-computed," he said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Every calculation, every correction factor, every environmental variable." Commander Lale moved closer, studying the chart over Rodriguez's shoulder. The document was a masterpiece of preparation, a comprehensive reference that accounted for air density, temperature variations, altitude changes, and even minor factors like wind resistance and engine efficiency fluctuations. "How long did this take you to create?" Lyle asked, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine curiosity. "About 6 months, Kira replied. "I started after reading the technical bulletin about the D-patch update. I wanted to understand the fuel system well enough to fly without instruments if necessary." Captain Morrison spoke up from his seat, his voice carrying a hint of the respect that had been absent that morning. "You mean you prepared for today's scenario 6 months ago?" Kira nodded. The technical data suggested that certain environmental conditions could cause the flow meters to provide false readings. "I wanted to be ready if that happened." The room absorbed this information in silence. While they'd been flying by feel and trusting their instruments, she'd been preparing for the day when technology would fail them. Her excessive caution, her methodical approach, her insistence on understanding every system, it had all been leading to this moment. Lieutenant Bradley examined the chart more closely, tracing the penciled calculations with his finger. "These numbers, ... They matched the mission profile exactly. You calculated the entire flight path before takeoff." "I calculated multiple scenarios," Kira explained. "To different weather conditions, various fuel loads, alternate routes, emergency procedures. Today's mission was just one of the profiles I'd prepared. The implications were staggering. She hadn't just completed a difficult mission, she'd done it using a level of preparation that none of them had considered necessary. While they'd relied on technology, she'd relied on knowledge. While they'd trusted their instruments, she trusted her mathematics. Commander Lyle picked up the chart and studied it more carefully. The calculations were dense, complex, and entirely accurate. Every factor that could affect fuel consumption was accounted for, Every variable that could impact flight performance was included. It was the work of someone who understood aviation, not just as a skill, but as a science. "Lieutenant Davidson," he said finally, "when you warned us about the fuel system problems this morning, why didn't you mention that you prepared for this scenario?" Kira's expression didn't change, but her voice carried a subtle edge. "I tried to warn you about the technical issues. I was told to just fly the profile." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Every person in the room remembered the morning briefing, remembered how her concerns had been dismissed, how her knowledge had been treated as unnecessary caution. They'd ignored her warning, and their aircraft had suffered exactly the problems she'd predicted. "Furthermore," Kira continued, "when my instruments failed and I reported the issue, I was ordered to abort the mission. I chose to continue because I knew the instruments were lying. This was the crux of the matter. She disobeyed a direct order, but she'd been right to do so. Her knowledge had been more reliable than their technology, her preparation more valuable than their protocols. She'd completed the mission not despite the system failures, but because she prepared for them." Technical Sergeant Rodriguez set the chart down carefully. "Ma'am, I've been working on aircraft systems for 15 years. I've never seen preparation this thorough. You didn't just plan for today's mission. You planned for every possible variation of today's mission." The compliment was sincere, professional, and long overdue. Around the room, other pilots were nodding in agreement. The evidence was undeniable. She'd outperformed everyone not through superior flying skills or better equipment, but through superior preparation. Commander Lyle stood up straight, his posture formal. "Lieutenant Davidson, I owe you an apology. We all do. Your warning this morning could have prevented the problems we experienced today. More than that," Captain Morrison added, "your preparation saved the mission. Without your success, we'd be reporting a complete failure to complete the assigned profile." Kira accepted the acknowledgments with the same calm demeanor she'd maintained throughout the ordeal. She wasn't gloating, wasn't demanding recognition, wasn't even showing satisfaction. She'd simply done her job, done it well, and proved that. Sometimes the quiet ones had the most important things to say. "The question now," Lyle continued, "is how we prevent this from happening again. And how we make sure we listen when someone with your level of preparation tries to share their knowledge." The room was transforming around her. The same pilots who'd ignored her that morning were now looking at her with respect, curiosity, and something approaching awe. She'd proven that meticulous preparation could overcome technological failure, that knowledge could triumph over instinct, that the careful ones sometimes knew things the confident ones missed. But more than that, she'd proven something to herself. She belonged in this room, in this squadron, in this profession. Not because she could fly like everyone else, but because she could fly better than everyone else when it mattered most. The aftermath of the debrief created ripples that spread far beyond the confines of the tent. Within hours, word of Kira's achievement had reached the squadron commander's office, the base operations center, and the training command headquarters. A pilot who'd flown a perfect mission using manual navigation while everyone else's instruments failed was the kind of story that captured attention at every level of the military hierarchy. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the squadron commander, requested a private meeting with Kira that afternoon. The colonel's office was a study in military efficiency. Awards and commendations lined the walls. Flight manuals filled the bookshelves, and a large window overlooked the flight line where aircraft were being prepared for evening training missions. "Lieutenant Davidson," Colonel Hayes began, gesturing for Kira to take a seat, "I've been reviewing your performance record. Exceptional academic scores, perfect safety record, consistently high marks in all technical evaluations. Yet, somehow, you've been flying without a squadron patch for 8 months." Kira sat with her characteristic calm composure. "Yes, ma'am. I've been waiting for a permanent assignment. Colonel Hayes leaned back in her chair, studying the young pilot with new appreciation. That's going to change. Effective immediately, you're being assigned to the squadron's Technical Advisory Board. Your primary responsibility will be reviewing and implementing safety protocols based on technical bulletins and system updates. The assignment was significant, a recognition that her methodical approach to aviation wasn't a weakness to be tolerated, but a strength to be utilized. For months, she'd been treated as an outsider who didn't fit the squadron's culture of confident improvisation. Now she was being asked to help shape that culture. Additionally, the colonel continued, I want you to develop a training program for manual navigation and emergency procedures. Today's incident showed us that we've become too dependent on automated systems. We need pilots who can think and fly like you do. The irony wasn't lost on Kira. The same careful preparation that had marked her as different, that had made her colleagues question her boldness and instinct, was now being recognized as exactly what the squadron needed. Her mathematical approach to flight, her meticulous attention to technical details, her insistence on understanding rather than simply trusting, all of it was suddenly valuable. Meanwhile, the ripple effects continued throughout the base. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez had pulled the maintenance logs for all aircraft in the squadron, cross-referencing them against the technical bulletins that Kira had been studying. The pattern was clear. The D-patch update had been installed on every F-16 in the fleet, and each one was susceptible to the fuel gauge errors she'd predicted. We've got a fleet-wide issue, Rodriguez reported to his supervisor. Every bird that flew today should have experienced the same problems. Most of the pilots just didn't recognize what was happening. An emergency maintenance stand-down was ordered for the entire F-16 fleet. Every aircraft would be inspected, every fuel system would be tested, and every gauge would be recalibrated. The technical bulletin that had been ignored in the morning briefing was now the subject of urgent action across multiple squadrons. Back in the pilot-ready room, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The same pilots who'd barely acknowledged Kira's presence that morning were now approaching her with questions, seeking her advice on technical issues they'd previously handled through intuition alone. Captain Morrison, who'd been among the most dismissive of her concerns, found himself asking about fuel consumption calculations. Davidson, when you're running manual calculations, how do you account for altitude variations during combat maneuvering? Lieutenant Bradley wanted to understand her navigation techniques. That visual reference system you used, is that something you could teach to other pilots? Even Commander Lyle, who dismissed her warning about the fuel systems, was acknowledging the value of her approach. Lieutenant, I'd like you to review all pending technical bulletins and provide recommendations for squadron training updates. The transformation was remarkable. In the space of a single mission, she'd gone from being the overly cautious outsider to being the pilot everyone wanted to learn from. Her methodical approach, her attention to detail, her insistence on understanding. Every system, all of it, was now seen as essential rather than excessive. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Kira saw herself. For months, she'd questioned whether she belonged in a profession that seemed to value confidence over competence, instinct over analysis. She'd wondered if her careful approach was a weakness, if her need to understand rather than simply trust made her inferior to her more confident colleagues. Today had answered those questions. She didn't need to change who she was to succeed. She needed to be more of who she was. Her strength lay not in becoming like everyone else, but in being the one person who could succeed when everyone else's methods failed. As evening approached and the flight line grew quiet, Kira walked past the row of grounded F-16s. Each aircraft bore the evidence of the day's system failures, diagnostic equipment attached to fuel lines, maintenance panels, removed for inspection, technicians crawling through access hatches to examine components. She paused beside the aircraft she'd flown that morning, the one whose lying fuel gauge had tried to convince her she was flying on empty while her mathematics proved otherwise. A maintenance technician was replacing the faulty flow meter, the very component she'd warned about in the briefing. "Excuse me, Lieutenant," the technician called out. "You're the pilot who flew this bird today, right?" Kira nodded. "I just wanted to say thank you. If you hadn't completed that mission, we might not have figured out the scope of this problem until someone got hurt." It was a simple acknowledgement, but it carried weight. She prevented a potential disaster, not through heroic flying or last-minute improvisation, but through careful preparation and the courage to trust her knowledge over popular opinion. As she walked toward her quarters, Kira reflected on the day's events. She'd always known she was different from her colleagues, had always approached flying with more calculation and less instinct than seemed normal. Today had proven that different didn't mean wrong sometimes, it meant essential. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to apply her methodical approach to aviation. But tonight she could rest in the knowledge that she'd found her place in a profession that had seemed determined to overlook her. She belonged here, not despite her differences, but because of them. 6 months later, Kira stood at the front of a packed briefing room, but this time she wasn't waiting to be called last or hoping to be heard. The room was filled with pilots from 3 different squadrons, all gathered for the monthly technical review session that had become one of the most important meetings at Nellis Air Force Base. "Today we're reviewing the November technical bulletins," she announced, her voice carrying the confidence that came from proven expertise. "We have updates on hydraulic system monitoring, avionics cooling procedures, and a critical alert about engine temperature sensors." The pilots listened with the kind of attention that had been absent from briefings 8 months earlier. Notebooks were open, questions were prepared, and nobody was checking their phones or cracking jokes during technical discussions. The culture had shifted, and Kira had been instrumental in driving that change. Captain Morrison, now sporting the additional responsibility of Squadron Safety Officer, raised his hand. "Davidson, the engine temperature issue. Are we looking at the same kind of systematic problem we had with the fuel gauges?" It was exactly the kind of question that demonstrated how much the squadron had learned. Instead of dismissing technical concerns or assuming the problems would be rare, they now approached each bulletin as a potential fleet-wide issue that required proactive attention. "Good question," Kira replied, clicking to the next slide in her presentation. "The temperature sensors use a different system architecture, but there are some concerning parallels. I recommend we implement precautionary measures immediately, rather than waiting to see if problems develop." The recommendation was accepted without debate. The squadron had learned the value of preventing problems rather than reacting to them, and Kira's track record of identifying issues before they became critical had earned her the kind of credibility that transcended rank and seniority. After the briefing, Colonel Hayes approached with a folder containing new orders. "Lieutenant Davidson, I have some news. You've been selected for the Advanced Flight Test Program at Edwards Air Force Base. It's a significant opportunity. You'd be working on next-generation aircraft systems and helping design the training protocols for future pilots." The assignment was prestigious, the kind of opportunity that typically went to pilots with years of experience and proven leadership records. For Kira, it represented validation not just of her technical skills, but of her approach to aviation. The military was investing in her methodical mindset, her attention to detail, and her ability to think beyond conventional wisdom. "There's one condition," the colonel continued with a slight smile. "They want you to finish developing the manual navigation curriculum here first. Apparently, word of your training program has reached some very high levels, and they want every pilot in the Air Force to have access to these skills." The curriculum Kira had developed over the past months had indeed become something special. It combined traditional navigation techniques with modern safety protocols, teaching pilots to fly effectively, even when their most sophisticated systems failed. The program had already prevented 2 potential accidents, when pilots trained in her methods had successfully handled equipment failures that might have been catastrophic for others. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, now heading the base's technical training division, had become one of her strongest advocates. What Lieutenant Davidson taught us, he often told visiting officers, is that technology should enhance human capability, not replace it. When you understand the fundamentals, you can handle anything the machines throw at you. The transformation extended beyond individual pilots to the entire squadron culture. Technical bulletins were now reviewed immediately upon release. System anomalies were investigated thoroughly rather than dismissed as isolated incidents. Pilots were encouraged to ask questions, raise concerns, and challenge assumptions rather than simply follow established routines. Perhaps most importantly, the squadron had learned to value different approaches to problem solving. The pilots who flew by instinct still had their place, but so did the pilots who flew by calculation. The confident risk-takers were still appreciated, but so were the careful planners. Diversity of thought had become a strength rather than a source of division. As Kira packed her office for the transition to Edwards, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 8 months ago, she'd been the outsider who didn't fit the squadron's image of what a pilot should be. Her methodical approach had been seen as weakness, her caution as lack of confidence, her preparation as unnecessary complexity. The fuel gauge incident had changed everything, but not because she'd suddenly become a different person. She'd always been capable of what she'd accomplished that day. The knowledge, skills, and mindset had been there all along. What had changed was the recognition that her approach had value, that her differences were strengths rather than weaknesses. Her final meeting was with a group of new pilots who just arrived at Nellis for advanced training. Among them was Second Lieutenant Rebecca Torres, a young pilot whose academic record showed the same attention to detail and technical curiosity that had marked Kira's early career. Lieutenant Davidson, Torres asked after the orientation session, "I've heard about your manual navigation program. Some of the other pilots say it's unnecessary, that modern systems are reliable enough that we don't need backup skills. What would you tell someone like me who wants to learn but doesn't want to be seen as overly cautious?" Kira smiled, remembering her own doubts and uncertainties from just months earlier. "I'd tell you that being prepared isn't about lacking confidence in your equipment. It's about having confidence in yourself. The pilots who learn these skills aren't the ones who don't trust their instruments. They're the ones who understand that instruments are tools, not crutches." She paused, looking around the room at the eager faces of the new pilots. "More importantly, I tell you that there's no single right way to be a pilot. Some people fly by feel, others fly by calculation. Some trust their instincts, others trust their preparation. The best pilots find ways to combine all of these approaches, and the best squadrons create room for different kinds of excellence." It was advice she wished someone had given her months earlier, but perhaps the lesson was more valuable for having been learned through experience rather than instruction. She discovered her own path to excellence, not by changing who she was, but by refusing to apologize for who she was. As she walked across the flight line for the last time as a Nellis pilot, Kira could see the evidence of changes that would outlast her assignment there. Pilots were conducting more thorough pre-flight inspections. Technical discussions were treated with more seriousness. The maintenance crews were consulted more frequently about potential system issues. The F-16 she'd flown during the fuel gauge incident sat in its usual spot, now equipped with updated systems that eliminated the problems she'd identified. A small placard near the cockpit identified it as the aircraft used in the manual navigation demonstration that had become legendary throughout the training command. She'd left her mark not through dramatic heroics or exceptional flying skills, but through the simple act of being thoroughly prepared when preparation mattered most. She'd proven that quiet competence could be just as valuable as loud confidence. That methodical planning could achieve results that instinct alone might miss. Most importantly, she'd learned that belonging wasn't about becoming like everyone else. It was about finding the place where your unique strengths were valued and needed. For years, she tried to fit into a culture that seemed designed for people different from herself. The breakthrough had come when she stopped trying to fit in and started focusing on standing out for the right reasons. As her transport aircraft lifted off from Nellis, heading toward her new assignment at Edwards, Kira looked down at the base that had taught her so much about herself and her profession. Somewhere below, other quiet pilots were probably struggling with the same question she'd faced, wondering if their careful approach to flying was a strength or a weakness. The answer, she now knew, was that it could be either, but it was up to them to make it a strength. Excellence came in many forms, and the best organizations were those that recognized and cultivated all of them. Her fuel gauge had been lying that day, but her numbers had told the truth. In the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all. Trust your preparation, believe in your knowledge, and never apologize for being the person who does the homework while everyone else wings it. Sometimes the quiet ones change everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.